I'd like to now tell you about my first guest, author Jason Sheehan. We will be talking to him from his home in Denver about his memoir from Farrar, Straus and Giroux, Cooking Dirty, a story of life, sex, love, and death in the kitchen. And believe me, it's all that and more. Jason is a food writer at Denver's alternative weekly paper, Westword, and in 2003 won the James Beard Award in that category. His work has appeared in Best American Food Writing for the past 5 years. But of course, when he wrote this book, this is his memoir about his early times leading into being a food writer. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you about this book because I mentioned to you prior to the show, the beginning of the show, I certainly normally read a couple of books a week, but this book is filled with so much that I haven't finished it yet. I went back and reread parts, and I want my listeners to know that. There's a lot of stuff here. So I'm just going to start out by saying this is your first book. Yep. Cooking Dirty, and it's a memoir about, as you say, a blue-collar kid from the Rust Belt of Rochester, New York.
Yep.
Now, it's inevitable that you have been compared to Anthony Bourdain and his book Kitchen Confidential. So my first question is, how do you feel about that?
You know what? I'm just fine with that. That's good company to keep. It was a fantastic book. He did great work when he was working on it. And it's sort of, his fault that I get to do this now. It's sort of very personal writing about kitchens and stuff.
That's right. And it certainly has encouraged a lot of young writers to do it. So just because he did it first doesn't mean he owns it.
Exactly.
So, now, much of its content is R-rated. But your first experience in the kitchen of the neighborhood Italian place in your hometown of Rochester influenced you for the rest of your life. And
the very first minute.
Yeah, yes, the very first chapter really tells it all. So tell my listeners what it was like for a teenager who had no idea how to cook to find himself in that position.
It was the best possible place I could have found myself. It's the luckiest break I've ever had in my life, walking into that place on the first day. I only got the job because I was underage. I was 15 years old, and this was the only place in town that would sort of, take on a 15-year-old kid who knew absolutely nothing about anything, and pay me to work there for a few hours a night, and then many, many, many hours a night later on. And walking in, I was the kind of kid, I just sort of knew that I'm never going to be happy sitting at a desk. I'm never going to be happy, selling insurance. I grew bored incredibly easily. And this, from the very first moment, this was a life I knew I was never, ever, ever going to be bored. There was never going to be a minute where I'd think there was something better or more useful or more worthwhile or more exciting I could be doing with my life.
But now at the age of 15, weren't you still in school?
Yeah, I was still in high school.
So you didn't quit school, though? You
No, I managed to finish high school. Not much more than that, but I did manage to finish high school. When I first started, I would get out of school at 3:00, and the pizzeria where I worked was literally right down the street from the high school. So I would just walk down there. I'd show up 3:15, 3:30, something like that, and work through the evening shift, and then I worked weekends there as well. So,
well, give my listeners a little brief overview about some of the things that happened in that restaurant. I want people to get a feel for what the book is like in terms, and your descriptions are terrific, by the way. So give us an idea about what a typical night might be when you really then got into it.
It's funny. I mean, my first job in a kitchen, I wasn't cooking. No one in their right mind would let me near the food that would actually be going to regular people. I was hired to essentially scrape trays. All the dough in the place was hand tossed, and it was double risen dough. So they'd take balls of the pizza dough, turn it, put it onto a sheet tray, let it rest, let it rise, pull it off of that sheet tray, turn it again, put it into a second rise, and every time they did it, they produced trays that were sort of, gummed up with little bits of dry pizza crust and stuff like that. And my first job was scraping those trays, cleaning them up to get them ready to put into the World War I vintage automatic dishwasher they had in the place. A dishwasher that would literally explode and shoot gouts of stinking water out if I'd left 1 micron of pizza dough on it. If they weren't perfectly clean before I put them into the dishwasher would just sort of choke out and die and flood the entire kitchen, which I did several times on my first night of work and several times on every following night of work. So that was my actual first gig, scraping trays and then trying to run them through a dish machine that I was completely unqualified to use and was given no training in the operation of.
And it was family owned. Now it was called Farrar's Pizza. Is that the real name of the place? Because
that's the real name. I changed. The lawyer suggested that I change a lot of the names in the book. Farrar's I kept because it was so moving to me. And unfortunately it's no longer there in Rochester, but it's well known and well loved. I was actually just back in town recently with some old friends from town, and they had read the book, and all we talked about was how if Ange and Natalie Farrar would just open up the place for one more night, we'd pay $300 a piece, buckies for one of those pizzas.
And they were very kind to you.
They were.
I mean, they really were great, and he taught you a lot, and he was very patient, tough but patient. Yep. So he was quite a guy.
He was. I mean, he's, if I had anything like a mentor in my life, I mean, he, without ever knowing it, I mean, he was it. He, not only did he show me the sort of basics of how to do the job that he'd hired me for, eventually how to turn the dough and how to shred cheese and how to make the sauce, all these really sort of basic things that were like breathing to him. They were just reflex. He could do it, he just shut his brain off and he could do this stuff perfectly. But he also, I mean, he was the first sort of real chef that I knew. He was a guy who was completely at home in this environment, in this kitchen. There was nothing that could throw him. There wasn't an inch of the place that he didn't know. And he's who I wanted to grow up to be for a very long time.
I also found it fun that you mentioned in the book your secret life that you kept to yourself. That even when you were little, every time you go shopping with your mom, you would demand that she buy you cheese and a different cheese every time. So it seems like it's obvious from that you were learning and had a love of all of that at the time. Was that when you were also hiding the gourmet magazines?
Yeah, and all through the years. I mean, it's not. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. It's just, it's, I guess, not that cool to have this sort of intensive love for food and for cooking and for kids. And it wasn't really for cooking because I didn't cook much at home. It wasn't like, I was tagging around hanging on my mom's apron strings demanding to stir the sauce. It was just something about food in general, the actual physical stuff that fascinated me. And, and the taste of it and everything else. And, I mean, it was great training for growing up to be a cook someday, but, the sort of the older I get and the more I look back on it, I actually think it was better training for being a food writer, this sort of, this very deep need to sort of, have all this stuff and understand all these foods and where they came from and what they all taste like and why do some people eat this stuff and some people eat that stuff. So yeah, it was all fascinating to me, but kept sort of under wraps because
and you weren't thinking at that point of being a food writer. You were just enamored with this whole thing. And
I was thinking of being a rock star or a pirate or something.
Sure. like all guys.
Exactly,
young guys. Now, you end up going off to college. Was it after college that you ended up in the Chinese restaurant?
It's I made one sort of brief abortive attempt at going to college, which worked out incredibly poorly. And when I came home and had dropped out / been thrown out of college for the first time, it was sort of the same as finding that original job in the pizzeria. I had to find a gig. I was living back in my folks' house. They weren't pleased about the direction my life was going, and they sort of gave me the ultimatum. Find a job, find something to do with your life, or else. And my uncle, the family lawyer, came through in the clutch and hooked me up with friends of his who owned a Chinese restaurant.
And you became the bartender there, and it was at that restaurant where weekly the local swingers met.
Yep.
Now, it's not like you were a worldly kid, yet you seem pretty blasé about the whole scene, and you were also drinking and doing drugs and Is that how you were able to handle the whole thing? I mean, I can't imagine where you had a lot of experience with swingers, or maybe you did, but
it was, I mean, granted, the swingers thing didn't start until I'd been, I'd been in the job at the Chinese restaurant as the bartender there for, a few months before I even found out that they were having swingers parties in the basement, and then eventually got tapped to 10 bar for them. The whole time I was there, you're right, it all was an act. It was this sort of very studied, Rick at the Café Americain in Casablanca kind of thing. I mean, I wore a tuxedo to work, not because I was told to, but because I thought it looked cool.
Right.
Just to be able to stand in this deserted, very fancy, but essentially almost deserted Chinese restaurant, 5 or 6 nights a week, with only these regulars who came in who were all my friends, and yeah, I mean, it was just part of it was an act, and part of it was sort of everything I learned about living a life of crime. I learned from working in that place.
Well, it sure sounded that way. I mean,
and it's when you're in that position and you're sort of thrown in with people who this has been their life for a very long time. This is how they've run their business. This is how they've done things. Getting the middle of the night liquor shipments and the gambling in the back and everything else. They're all cool with it. So suddenly you're the new guy and you're tending bar, which is sort of the centerpiece of this sort of thing. You want to act like you're cool with all of it too.
Right.
And I was fascinated. There, again, no better gig for, 19, 20, 21-year-old kid than working in a place like this. It was like living in a movie, a film noir crime movie every night of the week.
Well, that's it. I mean, I felt at times like I was reading a porno story or a movie, but
exactly,
it is fascinating. But let's get to when you finally started working in that kitchen. Your first kitchen, I can't remember now in the book because there's so much, if that was in Rochester, if you went to Buffalo, where you described the law of the kitchen, that no matter what happens, everyone keeps on cooking. And I want you to tell one of those bizarre stories that took place in that kitchen.
You're talking about the all-night diner, right?
Yes.
Yeah, God, there was so many bizarre stories. Yeah, in the book, I essentially tell the story of what is essentially one night that I spent.
Yes.
That I spent cooking there. To that point, essentially the worst / best night of my life. But yeah, I mean, this was an all-night diner. Sat, I don't remember the exact number. I think it's in the book. It sat, 150, 180, 200 people, something like that. And it was the only place within miles that was open all night. So every bar in the area, when last call came, they all emptied into this restaurant. So we would get a massive crush of people at like midnight, another that would run till 2 a.m, another massive crush at 2 a.m. that would run till 4 or 5 a.m, basically every night of the week. And we had, 4 or 5 guys running the kitchen, and it was a situation where we're doing so much business, 200, 300, 400 covers in, a 4 or 5 or 6 hour stretch, that the only thing that would matter is that you could show up, on time for your shift, do the job without injuring yourself or anybody else around you, and then survive it to get to the next day just to do it all again. So the kind of people who would work in that job were all crazy. They were all guys like I was at the time, who were in it for the adrenaline, for the thrill of just knowing that you can survive this kind of business, this kind of rush, this kind of hit, this kind of
most
action.
of them couldn't speak English, so you had to learn the patois of the kitchen as well.
Yeah, well, it wasn't that they didn't speak English. It's that it's their own kind of English. I mean, one of the things that I grew to love almost as much as the food about kitchens is that they have their own language. They speak, they speak essentially an invented language that's been constantly evolving since the 1940s. It's all slang and jargon and, just incredibly made up words. So if a word is 2 syllables long, you have to make it a 1-syllable word. If a word is 12 letters long, you have to somehow make it 5 letters, because the extra second that it takes to say that extra syllable is too much. That's wasting too much time, so we want to get to it even quicker. And then it's also French and a lot of Spanish, and God only knows what other languages thrown in there. So yeah, it's this incredible thing that you sort of, when you learn the language of the particular galley that you're working in, that's sort of like learning the history of the kitchen that you're in. you learn sort of where these words, where these phrases came from, where the language came from. If it's a heavily Mexican kitchen, it's going to be a lot more Spanish. If it's a heavily Vietnamese kitchen, it's obviously going to be a lot more Vietnamese.
Now, you're in the diner, and I want you to tell us the story. Again, this is just one of many bizarre stories, but I want you to tell the story of the guy in the deep fryer.
Gotcha, yeah.
And the deep fryer.
Yeah. We had hired on this kid. We would run through staff on the night shift really quickly. Usually 2-3 days was all they would last. But we'd had this kid who'd come on. He was, 16, 17 years old, something like that. It was his first job, and it was his second or third night on the job. And he was working fryers with one of the other cooks. He was sort of backing him up. And the other cook would keep all of his spices and things like that balanced on a sheet tray in between these two big double bay Fry-O-Later fryers. Somehow, this kid manages to knock something into the fryer, and without thinking, he just goes in after it, both hands, sticks them both into a 450-degree deep fat fryer, pulls them out again, and we thought the kid was going to die. I mean, it looked like his hands were melting, but it was actually he was the only one in the kitchen who was wearing gloves, so the gloves had melted to his hands. And essentially, this kid crippled for life for $6 an hour. And in the book, it's this terrible story, and we feel so bad for him. But nobody, we never even went to visit him, in the hospital or checked to see if he was ever going to be okay, because he was just sort of, at that point, another body. And next night, there was a new kid in there again, so.
Yeah, so he got pulled out of there and sent to the hospital, and you guys kept on cooking.
And we kept on cooking, and the only thing that we were reminded of by the manager on duty was to not use that fryer, because we had to pull and drain it, because there was probably still some parts of the kid in the fryer.
Oh, so. I don't think I'm ever going to forget that scene. That was pretty gruesome. The poor kid.
That was.
Well,
I win a lot of bar bets with that story.
I bet you do. Well, here you are, and you're all doing drugs and drinking and everything else. So it's not like you're this gang of innocents, but you're all working very well together, and you're really turned on to this whole thing. And of course, I think the next thing that I want to talk about, because being a Buffalo girl myself, I remember Friday night fish fries. Now, Friday night fish fries, for those of you who do not know, is a tradition in many East Coast cities, and especially Buffalo and Rochester, where you came from, and probably in Connecticut. I'm not sure about that, because I know when I moved to Boston, I was looking for a fish fry that you could get fish, but not the typical fish fry. Now, here you were. Yeah, right. Here you are. You're the wheelman who's in charge of getting all the supplies together. And right. What did you forget one night?
On a Friday night, I forgot to pull the fish for the fish fry, and we would probably be doing easy 200 orders of it on a Friday night.
And here you are with frozen fish. Give us a brief overview, because that's the funniest darn thing, as to how you thawed the fish to get it all going.
Power sprayer. Power sprayer plugged into the hot water outlet on the water heater. Because they come frozen in these big 10, 20-pound fish cases, plastic fish cases, and it's basically a giant fish popsicle. And pull them out of the coffin freezer, and it's just one solid chunk of fish. So yeah, we went after them with the power sprayer to get the ice off and to get them thawed.
But then something happened that night after all of that, because of all of the thawing and everything. Didn't something explode?
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah.
After we thawed them that way, because you're thawing them so fast, obviously we're messing up the fillets pretty badly. So they are not going to survive, going into the batter, then going into the fryer, and then coming out of the fryer without just falling to pieces. So the simplest solution was you sort of, you almost poach them beforehand. You set up bain-maries, sort of double boilers, and we would put all the fish fillets in sheet pans on the top of these double boilers and cover them over with plastic wrap, so they're sort of half steaming and they're getting a little bit stiff, so they'll be able to hold the batter and not just crumble to pieces in the fryer. We'd put bain-maries out on every single burner that we had available, and had forgotten to turn off the gas to 4 of the elements that we didn't usually use in normal kitchen operations. So it was essentially just filling the hood and the back of the kitchen with gas for about a good hour before it caught a spark off of what I assume is the toasters that work next to it, and exploded.
Describe what the kitchen looked like after that explosion.
It was a kind of mini Hiroshima. It was this huge fireball, and then that continued to burn on top of the stove. Every kitchen has a fire suppression equipment called an Ansel system, and if that thing gets triggered, the entire kitchen gets filled with fire retardant foam, and you can't work for the rest of the night. So we're desperately trying to put out this fire. I had actually managed to light my hair on fire. The guy who was working next to me burned his hands fairly bad, just trying to crank down the elements to get it turned off. Somebody had ran for a fire extinguisher, and then coming back, they had slipped on the water, so it laid themselves out flat in the kitchen, and it was Three Stooges hilarious.
He knocked himself out, didn't he? And he's in all this mess of batter and pieces of fish on the floor. And
it's just and two of the guys who I was working with then decided that they were going to choose this moment to settle some differences from earlier in the night, and got into a fight. And rather than there's knives and all this stuff laying around it. Rather than, going after each other with knives or pots of burning oil, they chose to throw fish at each other. So, yeah.
But by the end of the night, you had served how much fish? Quite a few.
Oh, we'd served, basically all we'd had, our usual, 100, 200, something like that. A lot, in any event.
Well, I have to tell you, I love fish fries, but, after that scene, I thought, I don't know if I want a fish fry the next time I go to Buffalo.
Number one, I would hope that most other cooks out there are somewhat more responsible than I was at
sure.
21, 22 years old. And number two, it was still edible. It actually was not. It was not the worst fish fry I've ever had.
Well, very creative anyway. I thought that was one of the best parts of the book. There's a lot of good parts. But okay, well, you're still a cook, and you never thought of yourself as a chef.
Right.
But you, as we said, you were a closet lover of Gourmet Magazine and French cooking, and you did try to recreate recipes. How long was it before you finally ended up in a French restaurant in Buffalo? And then tell us what happened in that French restaurant.
It was a couple, 3 years. I consider my entire career to sort of be my apprenticeship, and so I was working my way up. I was line cook and working in diners and all night joints, and then moved on to slightly better places and slightly better places and slightly better places. And I ended up getting a gig working in an industrial kitchen that supplied, 3 or 4 other small restaurants around the city, the sort of, prepped basic materials that they would need. These were sandwich places and French bakeries that didn't have full kitchens of their own. So we would make all the food for them, truck it out to them at the beginning of every day. The owners of this place eventually decided that they wanted an actual restaurant, with an actual kitchen and a real menu and everything else. And they hired a guy who became a really good friend of mine, Matt Peltier, who, as the chef for the place. But I had been doing so much of the prep, I sort of didn't want to be left behind. So I would just keep volunteering myself to go and work with Matty at the new restaurant. And eventually what it came down to is I just ended up showing up and starting to work there. Stopped my normal job and just started showing up at the new restaurant. And for a long time, Maddie and I were sort of partners in running that kitchen.
But then you got overlooked, and they brought in another chef. And at this point of time, then you started bouncing around a lot from Rochester to Buffalo and back,
right,
and on to Florida, back to New York State, and then went west to Albuquerque and on the move again, and then finally ending up in Denver, where
yep,
you live today. But in the meantime, you were very serious about the work. You lost fingers, had plenty of cuts and burns, and relished the craziness of the 18-hour days or nights.
Absolutely.
But you were also losing it. You were still drinking. You were still doing a lot of drugs. You were with a gal at part of this time who you eventually lost, and you were losing more than your girlfriend. But one May, something awful happened that would be repeated and basically ended your love of cooking. Can you give us a story about what happened there?
Yeah, I started suffering blackouts. Not necessarily while I was drinking or doing anything. I would just, all of a sudden, I would get, cold sweats, tunnel vision, and I would black out. The first time that it happened was pretty serious. I actually ended up having seizures as well, and I ended up in the hospital for a night. And nobody could really figure out what was going on with me. At the night that it happened, I was actually fairly healthy. I didn't have any more than a couple beers in me. I'd eaten well that day. I was actually out with my ex and her new boyfriend, oddly enough, like going to see a show that night when it had happened, and I ended up in the hospital instead. And I thought it was a one-time thing. I thought, okay, this was unusual and embarrassing and kind of annoying, but whatever. And I went back to work the next day, and then it happened again. And then it continued to happen for a couple weeks with some regularity. And I just, went to doctors, went to the hospital, couldn't really figure out what it was. And I ended up going back and living with my parents in Rochester at 26, 27 years old, something like that. And not really doing much of anything for 3 or 4 months. I was just I'd finally been broken by the lifestyle, I guess.
Yes.
And the funny thing about it is that I've actually heard that this has happened since writing the book. I've heard from other cooks that this has happened to, that eventually the lifestyle just catches up with you, and your body says, you know what, no more. We're done with this shit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's interesting what happens in life, because for you it probably turned out to be the best thing, because you're very much alive, and
I am.
you reconnected with an old flame from college who is now your wife.
Yes, she is.
Laura?
Yes, Laura.
Who's Laura. And she's actually the one that encouraged you to do some writing. So here you are, trying your hand at writing, and from what I remember in the book, you wrote a piece for National Public Radio, which resulted in someone contacting you to do some more writing. So,
yeah, the piece I did for NPR it was actually for the This I Believe project through NPR. That was sort of my entree. I'd been working my gig here in Denver as a food writer and restaurant critic for a couple of years, and got a chance to write a little 3-minute piece on barbecue for the This I Believe program.
Yeah, there's no such thing as too much barbecue.
No such thing as too much barbecue.
Great title.
And wrote that, and and recorded it for them, and then it got bumped a couple times for news stories, so it didn't run when it was supposed to, and it finally ended up running on like a Memorial Day weekend or something like that, when absolutely no one in the world was going to be listening to the radio, except that it happened to be that my now agent happened to be listening to the radio and heard it and liked it and dropped me like a 2-line email asking, hey, read your piece, you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, no, but I can give it a try. So.
Isn't that something?
And that's how it started.
Well, so all of us on the radio have to think that there's maybe one person that is out there listening and looking for someone, and will hear us. We're not just talking at
it
night.
Happens. I'm proof of that, if nothing else. It does happen. You just have to, if you can manage to hang on long enough.
Well,
maybe someone will hear it.
How did you get the job at the Alternative Weekly paper? Because it is an alternative paper in Denver, and of course that's a great place to be to work with an alternative paper, and you're still with them. But how did you get that job?
I was working for a different alternative paper down in New Mexico as also as a food writer and a restaurant critic, and it just Laura had spent years in Boulder and in and around Colorado and loved it up there, and we were together at this time, and we would, whenever we could find a minute between me writing, also working my last cooking job, and her working, we would go up to Boulder for like these little mini 18-hour vacations. And one of the times that we were up there, we got caught out in the rain, pulled a free copy of Westward out of the stands to sort of hold it over her head, and it happened to be the issue. In it, they were listing the restaurant critic job. Honestly, I don't remember writing the letter that I wrote to them, but I know that for some reason I refused to send a resume. I sent a 9-page long cover letter to my now boss, Patty Calhoun at Westward, saying why she should give me the job and forget all of these other people that she had been talking to. And over a course of a couple months and a couple meetings, I ended up sort of just walking into it that way.
And here you are, James Beard winner, and it sounds like you're very happy in your life as a food writer, yes. And angels were watching over you, and so...
Apparently, yeah. Angels wearing chef's whites.
All right, so you're going to continue with the food writing. Any plans for another book down the road, just quickly?
You know what? Absolutely. I had a blast writing this one. I wish I could tell you that I had a plan for some kind of brilliant follow-up to the first one, but I'm still sort of riding the wave of this first one coming out. I'll figure out what I'm going to do next later.
Well, I'm sure you will, and I want you to come back and chat with me when that happens. And Jason, I have to say goodbye to you now, but I'll tell you, I really enjoyed this book. I am going to read it and enjoy it even more now that I've chatted with you. And thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jacqueline. It was a blast.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.